number 10, Downing Street. Things are really not looking very good at all for the Prime Minister, as today we learn he scored an approval rating of just 11%. Figures from YouGov about today state that 70% of the British electorate do not approve of Sir Keir Starmer as the leader of the country, or indeed approve of his government. So here is the big question. Are Sir Keir Starmer's days numbered? Is he a dead Prime Minister walking? Well, I'm joined in the studio by the Reform UK MP and the Chief Whip for Ashfield, Lee Anderson, as well as GB News' political editor Chris Hope and GB News' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. Gentlemen, welcome to the studio. Let's start, Lee Anderson, with the poll out today, the YouGov poll. 70% of the electorate do not approve of Sir Keir Starmer's government. There have only been 3 times in recent history, I think we've got some graphics we can get on the screen, where a government has been less popular. The least popular was October 2022. Liz Truss, 77% disapproved. There's Sir Keir Starmer today on 70% disapproval rating. Liz Truss, as I said, in 2022, 77% didn't approve. And then it was Theresa May, 72%. This was the final days of the Brexit deadlock, where she was forced to quit. Actually, this is when the Brexit Party booted her out of existence because of those elections in Brussels and the locals. And finally, the final days of Rishi Sunak, just 3 days before he was annihilated in the election at 72% disapproval. Lee Anderson, in that company, is there any way back for Sir Keir Starmer, or is he a dead PM walking?
The walls are closing in on Keir Starmer. Just 3 minutes ago, Lee Anderson delivered the most brutal political takedown in recent British history, mocking the Prime Minister live on national television as his approval ratings collapsed to catastrophic levels. What Anderson said next has sent shockwaves through Westminster, and the Prime Minister's response reveals just how desperate things have become. The political establishment is in absolute meltdown, and what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the current state of British politics. This isn't just another parliamentary spat. This is the beginning of something far more significant, and the implications are staggering. Keir Starmer's world is falling apart, and everyone can see it. The Prime Minister, who once promised stability, competence and a return to serious government, is now watching his political capital evaporate in real time. The numbers don't lie, and they paint a devastating picture of a leader in freefall. Recent polling data shows Starmer's approval ratings have plummeted to levels that would have been unthinkable just months ago, with some surveys placing him as one of the most unpopular Prime Ministers in modern British history. The British public has spoken, and their verdict is damning. Trust in his leadership has collapsed, confidence in his ability to govern has evaporated, and the very foundation of his political authority is crumbling beneath his feet. But the numbers are only part of the story. What happened on live television just moments ago reveals the true extent of the crisis engulfing number 10. Lee Anderson, the Reform UK Member of Parliament and former Conservative Deputy Chairman, seized the moment with devastating precision. In front of millions of viewers, Anderson didn't just criticise Starmer. He mocked him, ridiculed him and exposed the yawning gap between the Prime Minister's promises and his delivery. Anderson's words cut through the usual political rhetoric like a knife through butter. He highlighted Starmer's failures on immigration, his broken promises on energy bills, his inability to control his own party, and his complete disconnection from the concerns of ordinary working people. The attack was surgical, calculated, and utterly merciless. Anderson reminded viewers of every pledge Starmer made during the election campaign, every promise of change, every commitment to put working people first. Then he systematically dismantled each one, showing how reality has failed to match the rhetoric. The contrast couldn't be starker. While Starmer promised to bring down energy bills, households across Britain are still struggling with eye-watering costs. While he pledged to stop the boats and take back control of Britain's borders, the small boat crossings continue unabated. While he committed to fixing the National Health Service, waiting lists remain at record levels and the crisis deepens by the day. Anderson's mockery wasn't just about policy failures, it was personal, pointed and designed to humiliate. He questioned Starmer's judgment, his competence and his very fitness to lead the country. The Reform MP painted a picture of a Prime Minister who is out of his depth, overwhelmed by the challenges facing Britain and desperately clinging to power as everything falls apart around him. The imagery was powerful and the message was clear. Starmer is failing, Britain is suffering, and the political class is doing nothing to stop it. Anderson positioned himself as the voice of frustrated millions who feel betrayed by broken promises and abandoned by a political establishment that doesn't care about their struggles. What makes this political assault even more devastating is the context in which it occurred. This wasn't a carefully staged opposition attack during Prime Minister's questions. This was live television, unscripted, raw and impossible to spin away. The Prime Minister's team couldn't prepare a response in advance. They couldn't brief friendly journalists to soften the blow. They couldn't control the narrative. Starmer was caught completely off guard and his reaction spoke volumes. Sources close to the Prime Minister describe him as absolutely furious, incandescent with rage at the public humiliation. But that fury reveals something far more significant than mere wounded pride. It shows a leader who has lost control of the political agenda, who can no longer command respect from his opponents, and who is increasingly seen as weak, ineffective, and vulnerable. The timing of Anderson's attack is no coincidence. It comes as polling data reveals the full extent of Starmer's unpopularity crisis. Multiple surveys conducted over recent weeks show a consistent pattern of declining public confidence. One poll places his net approval rating at -40, making him less popular than his predecessor at the same stage. Another survey shows that more than 60% of voters believe the country is heading in the wrong direction under his leadership. Perhaps most damaging of all, focus groups reveal that even people who voted Labour in the last election now express deep regret about their choice. The buyer's remorse is palpable, widespread, and growing stronger by the day. The collapse in Starmer's ratings isn't happening in isolation. It reflects deeper problems with his government's performance and the growing sense that Labour has no answers to Britain's mounting challenges. The economy remains stagnant, with growth forecasts being downgraded and business confidence evaporating. The cost of living crisis continues to squeeze households, with real wages falling and poverty levels rising. Public services are creaking under unprecedented strain, from the National Health Service to local councils facing bankruptcy. Crime rates are rising in many areas and people don't feel safe in their own communities. Immigration remains at historically high levels despite promises of control, fueling public frustration and anger. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Starmer's predicament is the perception that he simply doesn't understand the lives of ordinary people. He's seen as a wealthy London lawyer who has never struggled to pay the bills, never worried about sending his children to failing schools, never feared walking home alone at night. The disconnect is profound, and it shows in everything he does. His responses to genuine public concerns often sound scripted, robotic, and completely detached from reality. When people are worried about immigration, he lectures them about compassion. When they're concerned about crime, he talks about root causes and social justice. When they're struggling with energy bills, he tells them about long-term climate commitments. The message people hear is clear: your concerns don't matter. Your struggles aren't important. Your voice doesn't count. Lee Anderson understands this disconnect, and he's exploiting it with devastating effectiveness. Unlike the polished politicians who populate Westminster, Anderson speaks in plain language that ordinary people understand. He doesn't use political jargon or bureaucratic euphemisms. He says what millions of people are thinking but feel they're not allowed to say. He gives voice to the frustrations, the anger, and the sense of betrayal that so many voters feel. That's why his attack on Starmer resonates so powerfully. Anderson's attack has also energised the opposition in ways that should terrify Number 10. Reform UK, the party Anderson now represents, has been steadily climbing in the polls, drawing support from disaffected Conservative voters and increasingly from former Labour supporters as well. The party's message of common sense politics, controlled immigration, and putting British people first is resonating with millions who feel abandoned by the traditional parties. Anderson himself has become one of reform's most effective communicators, able to articulate public frustrations in language that ordinary people understand and relate to. His willingness to directly confront and ridicule Starmer gives him an authenticity that focus group politicians simply cannot match. People are tired of careful political speak and pre-approved talking points. They want politicians who say what they mean and mean what they say, and Anderson delivers that in spades. The Conservative Party is also sensing blood in the water. Despite their own recent struggles and electoral defeat, senior Conservatives recognise that Starmer's collapsing approval ratings present them with an enormous opportunity. They're intensifying their attacks on the government's record, highlighting every failure, every broken promise and every example of incompetence. The opposition is finding its voice again, emboldened by Starmer's weakness and the growing public dissatisfaction with Labour's performance. What makes the situation particularly dangerous for the Prime Minister is that criticism is now coming from all sides simultaneously. He's being attacked by reform on immigration and cultural issues, by the Conservatives on economic management and public services, and even by elements within his own party who feel betrayed by his abandonment of progressive policies. The media narrative has also shifted dramatically against Starmer. Newspapers that once gave him relatively favourable coverage are now running increasingly critical stories about his government's failures. Television interviews have become more confrontational, with journalists pressing him harder on his broken promises and poor performance. Social media is awash with criticism, mockery, and devastating memes that highlight the gap between Starmer's rhetoric and reality. The Prime Minister has lost control of the story being told about his government, and once that narrative takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to change. People form impressions quickly and change them slowly, and the impression now forming is of a failing leader presiding over a failing government. Behind the scenes, Starmer's advisors are desperately trying to find a way to turn things around. They're conducting endless focus groups, commissioning private polling, and developing new messaging strategies. But all the spin in the world cannot change the fundamental problem that people's lived experiences contradict everything Starmer promised them. When someone is struggling to pay their energy bills despite promises they would fall, no amount of clever communications can make them feel better about the government. When communities are being transformed by uncontrolled immigration despite pledges to secure borders, people don't want excuses or explanations. They want action, results, and leaders who actually deliver on their commitments. Starmer has failed to provide any of those things, and the public is rapidly losing patience. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity to Starmer's crisis. Britain's standing on the world stage has been diminished by perceptions of weak leadership and domestic turmoil. Foreign governments are watching the Prime Minister's struggles with concern, wondering whether he has the political capital to deliver on international commitments. Trade negotiations become more difficult when other countries question whether the British government can survive long enough to implement agreements. Security partnerships are strained when allies doubt the stability and competence of British leadership. Starmer's domestic political weakness is translating into international vulnerability, and Britain's adversaries are undoubtedly taking note of the opportunity this presents. What makes Anderson's mockery so particularly devastating is that it crystallises all of these problems into a single memorable moment that will be replayed endlessly across news channels and social media. Political careers can turn on such moments. Once a leader becomes an object of ridicule, once they're seen as weak and ineffective, recovering that lost authority becomes extraordinarily difficult. Starmer now faces exactly that challenge, and nothing in his political background suggests he has the skills or instincts to overcome it. He's a technocrat thrust into a role that requires charisma, a lawyer trying to win a popularity contest, a cautious manager when circumstances demand bold leadership. The mismatch between the man and the moment couldn't be more obvious or more damaging. The road ahead for Keir Starmer looks increasingly treacherous, and the political landscape is shifting beneath his feet in ways that spell disaster for his premiership. The fundamental problem facing the Prime Minister is that he has exhausted his political goodwill without achieving anything substantial in return. Governments typically enjoy a honeymoon period after taking office, a window of opportunity where the public gives them the benefit of the doubt and allows them time to implement their agenda. Starmer has burned through that goodwill at record speed and now finds himself in the worst possible position for any leader. He's unpopular, he's seen as ineffective, and he has years of his term remaining with no clear path to recovery. The brutal mathematics of politics suggests that once a leader falls below a certain threshold of public support, climbing back becomes nearly impossible without some dramatic external event or crisis that allows them to reset the narrative. Lee Anderson's mockery has accelerated a process that was already well underway. The public rejection of Starmer's leadership and everything it represents. The Reform MP didn't create the crisis engulfing Number 10, but he has amplified it and given it a human face that people will remember. Political history shows us that moments of public humiliation can define and destroy leaders. Once the seal of authority is broken, once the Prime Minister becomes a figure of mockery rather than respect, the damage is almost always permanent. Starmer is now trapped in that dangerous territory, desperately trying to project strength and competence, while everyone can see the Emperor has no clothes. His attempts to appear in control only highlight how little control he actually has. His efforts to seem relatable only emphasise how disconnected he truly is from ordinary people's lives. The economic situation provides no relief for the embattled Prime Minister. Britain's economy remains stubbornly weak, with productivity stagnant, investment declining, and businesses increasingly pessimistic about the future. Tax revenues are disappointing, forcing difficult choices about public spending that will inevitably anger some constituency or another. The government's fiscal position is precarious, limiting its ability to respond to crises or fund popular initiatives that might boost Starmer's standing. Every economic indicator that disappoints, every downward revision to growth forecasts, every business that relocates overseas becomes another piece of evidence that Starmer's government is failing. The economic narrative has turned decisively negative, and without dramatic improvement that seems highly unlikely in the current global climate, that narrative will continue to drag down the Prime Minister's already dire approval ratings. Public services remain in crisis despite Labour's promises to fix them. The National Health Service continues to struggle with impossible demands, insufficient resources, and a workforce crisis that shows no signs of resolution. Waiting lists for treatment remain at historic highs. Accident and emergency departments are overwhelmed, and patients are suffering the consequences of a system under unbearable strain. Schools are dealing with crumbling buildings, teacher shortages, and funding pressures that limit their ability to provide quality education. Local councils are cutting services to the bone as they grapple with financial pressures that threaten to push more into bankruptcy. The police struggle to respond to rising crime rates with inadequate resources and low morale. Every failure of public services reflects badly on the government, and Starmer's inability to turn things around reinforces the perception that he simply isn't up to the job of governing Britain. Immigration continues to dominate public concern, and here again, Starmer has nothing to show for his promises. The small boats keep coming across the channel, sometimes dozens per day, carrying people who will likely remain in Britain regardless of their legal status. The numbers are staggering and the optics are terrible. Every image of migrants being brought ashore, every story of hotels being used to house asylum seekers, every report of local services being strained by new arrivals feeds public anger and frustration. Starmer promised to smash the criminal gangs facilitating these crossings, but the gangs are thriving and the crossings continue unabated. Legal immigration numbers remain at levels that most British people consider unacceptably high, transforming communities at a pace that generates resentment and social tension. The Prime Minister's response has been inadequate, his explanations unconvincing, and his promises increasingly hollow. The cultural and social issues that matter deeply to many voters also work against Starmer. He's perceived as being on the wrong side of debates about free speech, gender ideology, and British identity. His party's association with policies that many people view as extreme or disconnected from common sense creates ongoing political vulnerability. When ordinary people express concerns about these issues, they're often dismissed or condemned rather than listened to and respected. This creates a sense of alienation and resentment that drives voters away from Labour and towards parties like Reform that validate their concerns rather than lecture them. Anderson understands this dynamic perfectly, which is why his attacks on Starmer resonate so powerfully with so many people who feel their voices have been ignored for too long. The prospect of recovery seems remote given all these accumulated problems, and Starmer's demonstrated inability to address them effectively. Political comebacks require either exceptional leadership skills that inspire renewed confidence or dramatic changes in circumstances that allow a reset. Starmer has shown no evidence of possessing those exceptional skills, and the circumstances facing Britain seem likely to get worse rather than better in the near term. The international situation remains volatile and dangerous. Economic headwinds are strengthening rather than dissipating. Social tensions are rising rather than falling. Every trend line points in the wrong direction for a Prime Minister, desperately needing some good news to change the narrative about his failing government. What Anderson's mockery has ultimately revealed is a truth that many suspected but can now no longer deny. Keir Starmer is the wrong leader at the wrong time, unable to meet the challenges Britain faces and incapable of inspiring the confidence and trust that effective governance requires. His approval ratings will likely continue their downward trajectory as more people reach this conclusion. His authority will continue to erode as his weakness becomes more apparent. His government will stumble from crisis to crisis, unable to gain traction or momentum. The question is no longer whether Starmer can turn things around, but rather how long he can survive before the pressure becomes unbearable. Lee Anderson may have just fired the opening shot in what could become an unstoppable campaign to drive this failed Prime Minister from office, and the political earthquake that follows could reshape British politics for a generation.